Hello and welcome to Lamestream, a show that guides you through the crisis in media and how it's impacting everything. I'm Osman Faruqi. I'm here with my co-host Scott Mitchell. Scott, it is our last regular episode for the year. It will be focused on the Bondi terror attack, which is the biggest story in Australia and really the biggest story in the world. But there's a few announcements about the show that we want to touch on before we get into the episode.
Yeah, first of all, you mentioned it's our last regular news-focused episode, but we do have, Oz, 3 special episodes we wanted to let our listeners know about. We'll be releasing over the summer to give people a break from the news and something to listen to over the holidays. We'll be back with regular episodes on the 19th of January, and one of those special episodes will be a mailbag where we answer everyone's questions. They are coming in thick and fast, but we wanted to let listeners know it's your last chance to get them in. If you've got questions about journalism, media, how things work, about us starting Lamestream, anything at all, please hit us up, contact@lamestream.com.au or DM us on Instagram. And we can't wait to get into all of them.
Cannot wait at all. And while we're doing announcements and reminders, a reminder that our summer sale on subscriptions is on for just another week. It's your last chance to grab an annual subscription to Lamestream at a discounted price. Subscriptions help us make the show, gives you access to our weekly newsletter and all of our articles. And we've got 2 more newsletters that will be coming out before the end of the year. Okay, so today on the show, we are focusing on the aftermath of the Bondi terror attack, including the media and political debate that is dominating the national conversation. We'll discuss the latest on the investigation into the shooting, look at how intently much of the media has tried to link this attack to the pro-Palestine movement, and how Benjamin Netanyahu's attempt to blame Anthony Albanese for the attack has essentially dictated how this issue has played out politically here in Australia. We'll also examine how the government is responding to the political attacks leveled against them, and later in the show, we'll get into the areas related to this conversation that we don't think the media is focusing on enough, including issues around gun reform, an issue that a number of media and political figures this week are dismissing as a distraction, which is honestly kind of mind-blowing to me. But we'll also look at the potential policing and intelligence failures that seem to have occurred here. Scott, before we get into all of that, I wanted to just take a second to reflect on some of the reactions to our coverage so far and give listeners a bit of an insight into what is going on behind the scenes on covering this topic.
Yeah,
you and I have reported all sorts of complicated, emotional, fraught issues over our career. Yeah, one for me that has been the most challenging has been covering white nationalism and far-right extremism, which is a tricky thing when you're one of the people the subjects of your reporting want to harm. It's led to blowback, threats, that kind of thing. I would say that our coverage so far of the Bondi shooting, which basically is our episode that we released on Monday, has been pretty sober and analytical, but it still has elicited the most intense feedback of anything we've covered, both in terms of the volume of the feedback, but also the specific nature and very negative and critical nature of some of it, which I think highlights how charged sections of the community are right now. We've been called Hamas sympathizers, and I've received numerous threats, which is not something I have actually ever experienced yet in terms of working on the show with you. And it's not really clear exactly what people are angry about, but I think it's an example of how tense, straitjacketed the conversation is right now. And I imagine that for just some of these people, they just don't like someone of my background engaging in this discussion. Some of it is just run-of-the-mill internet nut jobs, but I think there is also a really concerted effort going on right now to try to limit the conversation, who can participate in it, and what they say, especially if it's outside what the mainstream media narrative is focusing on, which we'll get into later in the episode.
Yeah, it's been a little disturbing to see. I mean, thankfully, it's a minority of people. We've also had some really, really lovely feedback about how much our Monday episode meant to people, how much of a island of sanity they found it, and how it helped them to navigate and think about the kind of tragic and horrific scenes that we've all seen. But yeah, we've put a lot of thought into the episode that we're making today and the conversation we're going to have, because we think it is really vital. The temperature is so high right now. There are such big claims being made. There's stuff going on that isn't really being aired in public right now, Oz, and we want to give the audience that conversation. We think it's so important to be honest, to air some of the things that are being sort of straitjacketed right now, and we've really considered how we're going to have this conversation today.
Yeah, we absolutely have. Let's start the episode, Scott, with the latest in terms of the investigation into the shooting. More of the 15 victims of this attack have been named, including husband and wife pair Boris and Sophia Gurman. Footage of them emerged attempting to tackle one of the gunmen at the very beginning of the attack. It was dashcam footage that emerged a few days after most of the footage on Sunday night was out there. They were pretty quickly shot and killed. The surviving alleged gunman, Naveed Akram, is out of his coma now. He's still recovering in hospital, and he's expected to be charged soon by police. That's what police have said. But there's been a number of pretty fascinating, interesting, and really important revelations about the background and alleged ideology of the shooters, Scott.
Yeah, absolutely. They have. These are sort of the newest series of revelations that have come out, and they now connect the alleged shooters to the Islamic State terror group even more than we knew on Monday. So 2 Islamic State flags were found in the car they used during the attack. The Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, has now confirmed, reporting by the ABC, that the son, Naveed Akram, was investigated by ASIO back in 2019 for a period of about 6 months, with ASIO even interviewing him directly. Sean Rubenstein Dunlop at the ABC, who's been reporting this, has gone on to reveal that the pair travelled to the Philippines as recently as November of this year to receive military-style training. This is significant, Oz, because Islamic State has a massive footprint in the Philippines. The group basically restarted the country's civil war a few years ago, and it's one of the few places left in the world where Islamic State still have a decent presence.
Yeah.
I should say, really, that on Monday, I did say in my comments, based on the vision, that the gunman didn't appear to have had very professional training from overseas in our conversation. And I had my reasons for saying that and did the right thing and flew that assessment past some people I know who are pretty knowledgeable about these things. But still, I think it's just important to quickly hold my hand up and acknowledge that, given how we've talked about how speculation spreads and how speculation can affect a story like this. Originally, Oz police said that Sajid Akram, who was shot dead at the scene, got his gun license in 2015. They've corrected that to say that it was issued in 2023, so after this ASIO investigation into his son Naveed, 4 years after that investigation for being potentially connected to an Islamic State cell. It's all pretty significant, Oz, because it adds to this dimension of radicalization, potential foreign involvement and communication with foreign Islamic State cells, and concern around further radicalization after Islamic State seemed to have gone dormant, really, in Western countries like Australia. It's been a long time since an attack like this was connected to the Islamic State. But most of all, Oz, it raises massive questions for our intelligence and security services. They say they looked into it back in 2019, found nothing, moved on. But Oz, once you are looked into, you have an ASIO file. You're on their books. How the weapons, the planning, the research for this attack, any electronic communications, the trip to the Philippines, like how any of that was not flagged by ASIO, did not trigger a reinvestigation, a re-looking into this, that a attack could be imminent, is really uncertain. And there's huge questions over how flags weren't raised about the pair.
Yeah, these new details do raise some pretty big questions for those agencies, particularly ASIO. And the focus in the media is now slightly starting to shift more towards that and what could and should have been done, and also on the significance of what appears to be potentially, the return of IS attacks in the West, which, as you pointed out, have really not been a part of life for a very long time. But Scott, really, the vast majority of media coverage up until now has been focused quite specifically on two real areas here, right? Anthony Albanese's personal culpability, or the allegations of his personal culpability for not being pro-Israel enough, an idea that's been injected into the national conversation by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who said that Anthony Albanese's support of a Palestinian state was to blame for this attack. And the other thing are these claims that pro-Palestine protesters and the pro-Palestine movement, more generally, is responsible for or to blame for the shooting. Broadly on the media and political reaction over the last few days, I've actually been quite stunned. I mean, I did expect the right-wing News Corp media to run predictable stories that blamed people who criticized Israel for this attack. I definitely expected One Nation to push a racist, self-serving agenda. I knew that we would end up demonizing Muslims and migrants pretty quickly, but I actually did not expect the entire breadth of the Australian media landscape to wholesale adopt the idea that Albanese was to blame for this, either because of a perceived failure to be more aggressively against anti-Semitism or for recognizing Palestine. I actually didn't even expect News Corp to specifically name individuals that they thought were directly responsible for the shooting because they were pro-Palestine, whether that's Greens MPs, whether that's people like APAN's Nessa Mashni, whether it's podcasters like Abby Chatfield. And I also didn't expect Pauline Hanson to get a red carpet treatment from the mainstream media. And I also didn't expect the coalition to so aggressively blame the Prime Minister, spark a debate about immigration, reject calls for gun reform. And kind of finally, in terms of the media stuff, one thing that just really stood out to me as something I don't think I could have seen coming was the Age newspaper publishing an editorial calling for a response to this attack akin to the war on terror after 9/11. And as I was thinking about all this stuff that had been going on and how overwhelming it was, how quick it was happening, I saw this post from Violet Ayad, who's a Palestinian actor from Sydney, that really resonated, and I asked if I could share what she wrote, and she kindly agreed. It just sort of encapsulated, I think, the rapidness of what is occurring and how a lot of people feel. She wrote, "It seems to happen quicker every time. When I was 10 years old, this is after 9/11, it took a few weeks to weave anti-Arab rhetoric into the war on terror. In 2023, anti-Palestinian racism took only a few days, as politicians labelled pro-Palestine protesters as terrorists. This time, within the first 24 hours, they were blaming this fresh horror on the recognition of a Palestinian state and anti-war protesters." I think that sums up how I feel and how I think a lot of people in the country feel right now. I genuinely am floored by the tenor of the media coverage and how uniform it is across different outlets, and what seems to be like fear that a lot of journalists have in pushing back against what is developed as the dominant narrative, and how much airtime and credence is being given to absolutely absurd ideas like the blaming of Anthony Albanese. Are you as shocked as me, Scott? How do you feel about where we are right now?
I think look at those same things just a little bit differently, in terms of I'm actually not as shocked about how badly some of that has turned. I think I had this deep foreboding, I think, about how the media and politicians just tend to react to massive tragedies like this. And with everything else going on in the world right now, I really did have this sinking feeling that it could be turbocharged and that the worst could come forward very, very quickly in the aftermath of that. And I think because I had such a sense of foreboding, actually over the last few days, I've been more, in terms of what I'm shocked by or surprised by, I think some of the understanding and kindness of regular people has actually surprised me in a good way. I think regular people who aren't as caught up in the daily churn of the media and social media, I think you look at how regular Australians by and large have reacted, and people have just been wanting to show their love and compassion to their neighbours, to business places, whether it's been me seeing friends in Bondi share really thoughtful messages. A friend of mine you mentioned sharing that message, a friend of mine, Dave Abram, who's a business owner in Sydney, couple of years older than me, but grew up in the East, shared a really beautiful message about Bondi, talking about how, he comes from a Jewish background and, is the descendant of survivors, and talking about growing up in a community filled with Jews from all over the world, but going to school with Palestinian kids, and that Bondi at that time in the 90s was a melting pot and much more diverse community than I think some people might imagine. And that's been really beautiful to see that outpouring. And I think, whether it's that or even watching, a current affair of all places interview this tradie that worked with Naveed Akram, and just seeing this tradie go like, oh, mate, this isn't about Muslims. This is an Islamic issue. You can't paint people with the same brush. It's got nothing to do with Islam. It's about one individual. And I just, seeing like a current affair tradie on there talk like that, I was sort of surprised in a positive way. And while there are, I think, ugly, scary forces in Australian life that are worse than they have been in decades, I think the average person is just so much more equipped than they would have been 10, 20 years ago in this moment. For the media part of it, I think we're seeing a real divide inside the media where the frontline reporting, some of it has been terrific, like local journalists, crime journalists, people who are actually down in the community reporting this story at the press conferences have been doing some powerful work and are kind of attuned to the complexity of the issues. The problem is, to me, Oz, the media these days is so set up that the federal politics reporters, the opinion columnists, the editors and the bosses have such a bigger influence on the entire coverage than those frontline reporters that they are defining the tone, despite the fact that none of them are actually doing the work on this story, actually talking to the people affected. So they're stumbling into this story, making really broad sweeping statements about entire communities, creating battle lines in the story, creating tension points. And I really didn't want to get into why that is with you in a second, but a real divide between the media and political narrative, which is becoming very, very toxic, and the way regular people are generally responding to this tragedy. And I think, I really, really agree with you in saying that, if anyone listening hasn't dipped their toe into the political debate that has started about this, it is so scary and concerning, Oz. I really agree with you that it is terrifying, some of the stuff that has been unleashed.
Yeah, we're going to get into it. I think it's a really important point you make. There is excellent interrogative, analytical, and really moving journalism being done by a lot of really, really great reporters. But in terms of where this goes from here, in terms of how the government responds, the tone and tenor of the national conversation, what we focus on, what we don't focus on, that is going to be led by the political coverage, which, as you pointed out, is what gets top billing. It's going to be led by the editorials in the newspapers, which are written by the editors who set the agenda. It's going to be led by the columnists whose incendiary pieces get read more, unfortunately, than the sharp, useful, actual on-the-ground journalistic pieces. So it's those things that we're going to predominantly focus on today's show. Like I said earlier, Scott, I'm not surprised by the attempts by News Corp to use this to blame pro-Palestine protesters or to sheet blame on the government for not being pro-Netanyahu and pro-Israel enough. But the fact that that's emerged as a broad consensus position throughout the Australian media landscape and how quickly that happened is striking to me. And the narrative, very simply being pushed here is that this attack was the inevitable outcome of anti-Semitism that erupted after October 7. The government failed to do enough to tackle it, and if it had, by, for example, implementing Gillian Siegel's report in full or cracking down further on pro-Palestine protests, then it could have prevented what we saw on Bondi. Now, obviously, there are significant logical flaws in that line. The key one being that when figures like Siegel and other pro-Israel figures talk about wanting to crack down on anti-Semitism and stop these protests, what they're really talking about is trying to outlaw or limit criticism of the Israeli government specifically. Like a big part of Siegel's report, which we broke down in an episode when it came out, is about stopping criticism of the Israeli government, right? Nonetheless, despite those logical issues, this became the dominant line in the political media immediately after the attack. On Monday, the morning after the attack at Bondi, the ABC's chief digital political correspondent, Claire Armstrong, wrote a piece entirely focused on this idea, saying that the key questions for Albanese after the shooting would be about his record on anti-Semitism, and she wrote about perceived failures from the government in stopping criticism of Israel from being linked to, quote, the existence of the Jewish community in Australia. Even though Armstrong Scott actually pointed out there isn't any specific recommendation in Gillian Siegel's anti-Semitism report that could have prevented this attack, she went on still to say there are questions about how seriously Albanese has been taking the issue of anti-Semitism. So even though that argument is being prosecuted, there is this tacit admission that it doesn't really make sense.
Yeah, there are so many articles like this at the moment, and none of them grapple with, most of the recommendations would have the effect of someone like Khalid Sabsabi not being able to access arts funding because he has certain criticisms of the Israeli state. That's what the report mostly does, or, university academics who have certain criticisms of the Israeli state being barred from appointments at universities. Like the idea that what appears to be a socially isolated, in and out of work individual who fell into the radicalization pit that linked him to the Islamic State and got training overseas, that pipeline of violence would be in any way stopped by those kind of recommendations is so patently ridiculous. And these articles can't really grapple with that contradiction except sort of a minor line like, oh, it isn't clear which one would. And you're like, no, that is the main point here, And
it does seem, and what I think is so frustrating about it, Scott, is that, like, we're not saying that there isn't work that needs to be done to, change attitudes and deal with rising extremism, in this country, whether it's the far right targeting Jewish people or broader issues to do with anti-Semitism or broader issues to do with racism. But the explicit way that is being linked to this idea that could have stopped this attack, that's where it all starts to get a little bit hazy. The ABC piece by Claire Armstrong is kind of indicative of where most political reporters and columnists took this story, though I would say that most of them are even more explicit in also bringing up the pro-Palestine protest movement. The Australian Financial Review's political editor Phil Curry accused the government of a lack of moral clarity and failing to do everything it could to stop anti-Semitism. And here he said that was because it was motivated by the concerns of Arab voters. And this stood out to me because this feels like a total rewriting of history. Like, did we forget over the last 2 years, the Anthony Albanese government was actually quite supportive of Benjamin Netanyahu? Took a long time for them to ramp up their criticisms. And in fact, Arab voters in these safe Labour seats, in a lot of instances, deserted them. We saw a campaign motivated against the Anthony Albanese government. So I don't really understand the logic there of what Curry is saying. Curry went on to bring up the protest movement. He included specifically mentioning student protests, encampments at universities, marches in Melbourne. He compared them to violent attacks against the Jewish community. In an opinion piece in The Guardian, George Newhouse said that chants at protest marches, quote, reinforced the message that Jewish people are fair game. So you could see in these examples, Scott, how quickly this narrative was emerging to link these attacks to protests. Also in The Guardian, the paper's chief political correspondent, Tom McElroy, didn't thankfully talk about the protests, but he did say the government can't say it has done everything possible to stop anti-Semitism. So again, this continuation of this narrative that had the government done more, had it passed specific laws on anti-Semitism or hate speech, it could have somehow prevented two radicalized IS terrorists from committing this act. And again, it's not to say that we don't need to do something to limit racism and anti-Semitism, but it's the linking of that to this Bondi attack that feels so thin. The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, Scott, I thought, were some of the biggest proponents of this line that doesn't make sense, and particularly in terms of advocating for what they think the response should be, basically wholesale endorsement of the Siegel report. The paper's chief political commentator, James Massola, said Siegel was 100% right in saying that it was time for, quote, strong action, not just words. And when Siegel says that, it's an obvious appeal to have her report endorsed in full. And that brings me to the second line of criticism that's been leveled against Anthony Albanese. Massola quoted Netanyahu, who blamed Albanese for this attack because of his decision to recognize Palestine. Massola said in response to that, whatever the merits of those arguments, it is true Australia's Jewish community has not felt safe in their own country for more than 2 years, and some of them blame the federal government. I mean, I don't understand how journalists are still just quoting Netanyahu's absolutely incendiary and ridiculous intervention and saying, whatever the merits. This is a war criminal who is dealing with corruption charges in his own country, who has lied and spread division and sowed hate, and has honestly shown very little care for the lives of Jewish people in Israel and around the world. He is so self-interested. Like, again, to reiterate, he is a wanted war criminal, right? So to brush off his statement with whatever the merits feels ridiculous to me.
And also, I'd also say, you know, if you want to talk about the anxieties of the Jewish community and their fears of their safety, it's actually, I think, inappropriate to link those just specifically to Netanyahu, you know, and to say, to put those straight after a quote from Netanyahu. There are, you know, deep differences of opinion on Netanyahu and his actions and his regime. And to put that all in one basket straight after a Netanyahu quote, as if he is the spokesperson of all Australian Jews, I think is also deeply inappropriate.
Yeah, and other people have made this point, you know, that like, other people have made this point. For example, you know, the Tree of Life synagogue shooting, which up until the Bondi attack was, you know, the worst kind of terrorist attack against Jewish people in the West, saw the deaths of 11 Jewish people. That occurred in the most pro-Israel country in the world. Like, no one is even really attempting to explain how a government policy position on recognizing Palestine could be linked to this. They just say it, and we're expected to take it at face value. And Albanese was also asked about this, about Netanyahu's accusation, by Sarah Ferguson on the ABC 7:30 on Monday. And it is kind of incomprehensible to me, Scott, at how a wanted war criminal has been able to completely control the domestic political and media narrative in Australia. And the biggest concerns about all of that to me, firstly, I think it shows how utterly hopeless and broken political reporting in this country has gotten, and appears to have gotten worse over the past 2 years. Like, the fact that history is being rewritten right now to try to cast Anthony Albanese as this pro-Palestine figure who deliberately ignored anti-Semitism in order to win the votes of Arabs and Muslims, that is just not what happened over the last 2 years, but that is the narrative that is now being pumped out by the most senior political reporters across the media. And again, not News Corp, the ABC, the Financial Review, the Age, the Sydney Morning Herald, elements of the Guardian. It's extraordinary. And the other thing I think this lays out is how deliberate and focused the effort is right now to use this terrorist attack to promote policies and actions that are designed to defend the interests of the Israeli government. Like, that's what Siegel's report is about. And in some instances, Scott, some of the critics of Albanese in the last couple of days are even more explicit about that. The Sydney Morning Herald reported comments from a rabbi in North Sydney who said very explicitly, criticizing the leaders of Israel is how you endanger Jews everywhere. Quote, when Israel is criticized, it's received by anti-Semites that it's okay to attack Jews. Now, that was just reported straight by the Sydney Morning Herald without any commentary or analysis about, you know, whether that is right or the risks of saying that stuff in this context. Not only is that obviously wrong, but those sorts of comments, that narrative, that line, which is being pushed by so many different figures, is designed to create a situation where it becomes impossible to criticize Israel or Benjamin Netanyahu. Either because if you do, you get accused of supporting violence and terrorism, or if people like Siegel have their way, it means you're punished and sanctioned. And that's what these stories, that's what this political narrative is about. And it is disturbing to see how widespread it is. And even some of those outlets that aren't pushing it super hard, they seem too scared to actually push back against that line. It is very obvious to me in a very negative way how little debate there is about whether this stuff is the right way forward. It feels like this extraordinary display of unity and cohesion from the Australian political media right now, but it's all pushing us in the worst possible direction.
Yeah, there is a version of history being written right now by the political reporters, by politicians, that just isn't the reality of how we have come to this place. And I don't think it marries up with how most Australians see this attack. It is a different version of reality. On why the media is doing it, Oz, I feel like I want to ask you about this. I can't help but feel like a big part of it is that today so many of the most influential positions in the media, whether that's editors, the Canberra Press Gallery, are held by people who come from News Corp, the Daily Mail, the tabloid press. And I'm talking about right across the media. You look at the ABC, the Nine newspapers, very senior positions are held by people from that tabloid background and from News Corp. I think it's almost a muscle memory for them. The only way how they know to engage with a tragedy and how to sell newspapers, sell stories, and this is whether they are the kind of News Corp people who are absolute knuckle-dragging, backwards morons, or whether they're the more straight down the line types. They are just used to doing these stories a certain way, which is smash labor, like hit labor as hard as possible, whip up fear, like, is this going to happen again? Could it happen all the time? And to beat up on community division and immigration. And not only is it so dangerous, not only is it misleading about the real substantive things that have led to this attack, I also think it only drives a further division and mistrust between the media and large sections of the community who just keep looking at this and going, this is not my reality. This is creating greater tension in my community. This doesn't speak for me.
Yeah, I think that is a real risk. They don't seem to really care about it, but that does seem to be a real risk. And I think it's a good point about how News Corp and ex-News Corp people basically run the show everywhere. Because when I think back to previous moments of, whether it's after a really horrific event like this, or a culture war issue, or a big point of political debate in Australia, when we were like coming up of age in this country, the 90s, the 2000s, you had the News Corp papers are running this line. The Fairfax papers are pushing back with that line. The ABC is trying to find a balanced way through it. And, that was sort of how this stuff worked. But when you think about why that doesn't seem to happen anymore, it kind of seems obvious that's because the News Corp people are everywhere. Like the ABC's most senior political reporters are people who have that News Corp instinct. That is how they run these stories. And I think that's part of it from the reporters. I think you're right. That term muscle memory, that's just the instinctive way they approach this stuff. And I talk about this a few times on this show because I really don't think it can be understated. I think the fact that the Fairfax papers, which historically were literally like the anti-News Corp papers, and we're proud of being like, we are not the News Corp tabloids, we do the opposite kind of journalism, so many of their most senior editors are ex-News Corp. And I've been in those news meetings, those editorial meetings when incidents like this happen, and immediately it's those senior editors that say, we are following this line, we're following that line, I want you to talk to that person, we are not going to investigate these three things because I just don't think that's important. And that sets the tone. And if the people setting that tone have built their careers at places like the Australian, the Daily Telegraph, the Daily Mail, that obviously impacts what we're all talking about, what we're all seeing.
Despite overseeing the complete decline of News Corp, by the way. News Corp in Australia selling less papers, having less readers. Those people seem to get appointed to the most senior positions everywhere else so they can wreck those newsrooms as well. Incredible.
It's absolutely astonishing. Scott, just before we move on from the media side of things, one of the other aspects that I found really quite astonishing is the incredibly soft to the point of glowing media coverage that Pauline Hanson has received from numerous outlets. Like, Pauline Hanson has no serious commitment to preventing anti-Semitism or racism. In fact, she has attended marches organized by far-right extremists who have stoked and encouraged anti-Semitism. her goal is so obviously to use this attack to shift the focus to issues that she wants to talk about, like cracking down on migration and blaming Muslims, which is already something she's doing. She's doing it very explicitly. But somehow she's been allowed to portray herself as some kind of significant, important leader at this time, because all journalists are doing is sticking a microphone in her face and letting her talk without asking even very rudimentary questions about her history, her political background, what things she might have done that relate to this issue, and what her policies and plans that she's proposing would do to keep people safe. Like, she's been all over TV and radio, given a platform to say whatever she wants and not criticized or critiqued for her inconsistency. And some of the coverage I have just never seen any other politician receive. The headline on the Daily Mail, which is the number 1 or 2 most popular, most read news websites in this country, said Aussies demand Pauline Hanson be made Prime Minister. Like, that is a Daily Mail headline. They're just shoving her in our faces. And, you know, what are the kinds of questions that I wish she was asked about? Well, we're going to discuss gun reform in a bit more detail later in the episode. But on Tuesday, 2 days after this attack, One Nation posted a photo of Pauline Hanson firing a gun. You know, and the kind of the caption was, "This is not about gun control. This is about radical Islam." 2 days after the worst mass shooting in Australia in decades, a politician posts a photo of themselves shooting a gun. Did you even know that happened? Do most people know that occurred? Have you seen much criticism of that in the media, even from the progressive media? Like, it's not there. And imagine if Fatima Payman or Lydia Thorpe did something like that. You can just imagine the level of outrage that will be driven up. The other absurdity of Hanson's intervention, she went to Bondi on Tuesday to the memorial with Barnaby Joyce, and she gave a press conference, and while she was there, she blamed protesters, she blamed student protesters, and she also talked about the need for hate speech laws.
Be weak and don't be pathetic in how you deal with issues. If you know there is an issue there, it's not about whether you're going to get the Muslim vote in some of these communities to ensure that you're in government. It's about doing the right thing right across the board, what's fair and just, right across the board for all Australians.
How do you disallow that hate and that extremism?
You pull them up. I would have them rounded up.
Round it up,
and you would be charged over your hate speech. It should not be allowed on our streets.
Scott, in November last year, she was found by the federal court to have breached Australia's only federal hate speech laws. She's literally in court now appealing that finding. But somehow none of that gets reported on these. None of that is reported, and everything she's demanding is being taken in good faith. It's actually just incredible how the very bare minimum of factual, accurate reporting on someone as extreme as Pauline Hanson is not happening at such a critical juncture for this country.
I have to say, the other thing I have genuinely been chilled by in the media this week, Oz, is this scene where Shari Markson put these questions to Senator Maureen Faruqi when Faruqi arrived at the Bondi Memorial on Monday afternoon. These are questions to someone coming to pay condolences. Shari Markson asked, You have been at pro-Palestinian protests where there have been calls for intifada and death to the IDF. How does that lead to anything else but the terror attack we saw here last night? So, Oz, those 200,000 or so Sydney-siders who marched over the Harbour Bridge after seeing emaciated, starving children, tens of thousands of Gazans killed, whole neighbourhoods flattened. Those people on that march who came together to call for an end to the killing, according to that question, your attendance could not have led to anything? Could not have led to anything else but the Bondi terror attack? Nothing else? There was no other outcome of attending a rally like that? That is such a shocking and disturbing and chilling question to be hounding someone with at this moment.
Yeah, it's shocking and disturbing because it, one, smears an entire movement of hundreds of thousands of people who, as you say, motivated to stop a genocide and the starvation of children. It sort of reaches an extra dark place when that blame is pointed to an individual. And, obviously, this is sort of close to home for me because Maureen is my mum. But the way that interview has kind of gone really viral amongst, right-wing people in particular, and been chopped up and edited, and, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of times it's been watched, with the implication that Maureen is personally responsible for the shooting on Sunday, is obviously distressing and frustrating. And the contrast between that and what Pauline Hanson got is also really stark to me, because what Maureen put out in her statement, around the memorial, which was not reported by Shari or these other people who've been running this line, is that one of the victims of the shooting who tragically died is a family friend of my parents, and that's why she wanted to go to pay respect and put flowers there. And she's also a senator for New South Wales. It's happened in her community. She goes to Bondi, and the response to that is these attacks where she's personally blamed, but when Pauline Hanson goes, she gets allowed to say whatever she wants and call for deportations. And I'm sorry, I'm getting quite emotional. It is personal, but I think even if it's not personal, it's just astonishing to me that these are the double standards that are applying. And have you seen one single journalist, Scott, in the media point out anything of this? Have you seen one person at The Guardian, at The Herald, at The Age, the AFR, say anything about how ridiculous it is to attack a person for going to pay respects to someone they've known for 30 years who worked with their husband? You haven't seen it, and it's really, really upsetting. Sorry for getting emotional during a professional podcast recording.
I mean, it's incredibly close to home, and it's really difficult to talk about. But at the same time, I think because no one is, somebody in the media has to talk about it. And so despite how close to home it hits, and that it is difficult for, us to stay objective or whatever, in the absence of anyone covering this, it is essential that somebody talks about this. Obviously, like, we could go on and on about how Senator Faruqi and her advocacy has not been about anything other than about Palestine and the state of Israel. It has not involved any kind of speech that would do anything to lead to this. But that does not matter to journalists at Sky News. They don't care about that. So I won't go on and on. The thing that is chilling to me about it, Oz, and why my reaction is fear rather than anger, is because we know this kind of rhetoric of making people's political speech comparable to violence, the same as violence, is it can have a really scary influence on disturbed people out there who might think of perpetrating really hateful acts. And I think it's really irresponsible to air those kind of questions and air that kind of rhetoric. And we have to highlight it, I think, because when no one else is, somebody has to say that there's a need to pull back from this kind of coverage before something bad happens. And to broaden this out from this example, which hits close to home, The Australian ran a piece this week titled, "You wanted blood and you got it. So spare us your shock. You did this." Listing off protesters, podcasters, social media influencers who spoke out against Israel under this heading, "You did this." Progressive social media influencers, quote, did, unquote, the Bondi shooting. I don't know how that can be printed by a major newspaper.
That was one of the worst and most dangerous pieces, because as you said, it's a very, very febrile and intense moment, and literally singling out people. Like, they named people. They named Palestinian advocate Nasser Mashni. They even named Abby Chatfield and implied that they're culpable. It's just extraordinary that this is the direction we're going in. And again, like, okay, sure, you can say it's The Australian, but I want to just reiterate this point. There's lots of journalists who work at places that aren't The Australian. There's an entire media company here in Australia that fundraises off the back of the fact that they are not News Corp. Why are they not calling it out? Like, where is that voice? And again, it's like left to the independent media to do this stuff, and I'm glad that we're doing it. But, we don't have the capacity to tap into millions of people like these places. Like, they have a responsibility here to push back, and it's really frustrating and upsetting that they're not. Scott, let's talk a little bit about the government response to this media furor. Like I said on Monday, I thought Albanese had struck the right tone at his press conferences, and as people who listen to this podcast know, I'm not like the biggest fan of Anthony Albanese, but I do think he's been caught a little bit off guard, perhaps, by how intense and unified and relentless this media narrative we've been discussing is, and how focused it is on blaming his government. So far, he hasn't really ceded ground. He's defended his government's record on anti-Semitism. He's announced changes to gun laws. He's appealed for unity. But I do wonder how long that holds up, because the media pressure is so relentless. I think your point is really important, that I don't think most normal people agree with what this narrative is, but governments tend to respond more to what the press gallery throws at them than what average people think, unfortunately. And I think one of the challenges he's got is he's a bit stuck. He hasn't really been willing to criticize Netanyahu for his intervention. He's dismissed it, he's disagreed with it, but he hasn't said, this is an insane intervention. How dare a foreign minister try to interfere in our domestic politics at this time? He can't really criticize Siegel either, because he handpicked her. So I kind of feel like the risk for him, Scott, is that he can't be as aggressive as he needs to be to fight back against these quite absurd criticisms. And now he's also dealing with these serious questions about the role of security agencies and whether more could have been done. I just wonder whether we start to see like political shift, whether he does give ground to some of these more outrageous calls.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating that on Sunday night, very, very early after this happened, both he and Chris Minns talked about gun law reform. We've learned more about that over the last few days, but they sort of signaled that was the direction they were going in. I think in any normal circumstances, after the worst mass shooting since Port Arthur, that would hold, as that is where the political debate would be taking place right now. There might be criticism of, was the government asleep at the wheel and allow guns to proliferate in the community, and should reform have been taken earlier? There could still be criticism of the government, but I think that would, if you're a politician, you'd naturally expect that to be the ground the debate is taking place around. Instead, the last few days, that has completely moved aside for this debate around Netanyahu's intervention, Siegel's report, that kind of thing. And I think it's left both Albanese and Minns struggling to know how to react to it, struggling to know how much to fight back, how much to deny, how much to concede ground, and kind of politically at sea. And yeah, I have sympathy for just how unusual these political circumstances are, that I don't think the government or really anyone could have seen coming out of a moment like this.
Yeah. Okay, after the break, we're going to take a look at some of the big questions emerging about the security and police response to the attack. Okay, after the break, we'll take a look at some of the big questions emerging about the immediate response to this attack and the attempts to kill off moves to reform our gun laws.
Oz, we've talked about some of the things the media is focusing on. We want to talk a bit about some of the issues in this story that we don't think are getting enough attention. We mentioned on Monday's episode briefly that while it's incredibly brave for police officers to run towards gunfire, 2 were shot during the attack, that there should be some space for questions about the systemic issues in the response to the shooting, how it was able to go on for so long, for so many people to be shot before it was stopped. Since then, Oz, more has come to light about what went on that's a bit concerning, and it isn't getting a lot of attention. There have been 2 questions, I believe, during press conferences, both very quickly shot down by the New South Wales Premier. Finally, on Wednesday morning, there was a really good piece that was explicitly about this idea of the police response by Jordan Baker at the Sydney Morning Herald, which included an anonymous quote from a senior police officer. And they said of the scene, quote, "They're gorgeous young kids, trained well and doing their best. When the radio is chaos, there's people screaming, a shotgun has blown people's heads off. It was over in 6.5 minutes. Oz, I think When police sources start describing officers as gorgeous young kids, you know there are misgivings about whether some of the police on the scene were overwhelmed. And I think police who are generally very defensive, that quote is a sign that there are some reasonable questions to be asked here.
Yeah, and it does seem like they're coming up, and it does seem like this is one of the things that the media is starting slowly to shift into. I know at a number of outlets there were very explicit decisions being made to not get into any potential issues with police on day one and day two, to focus on things like the victims. But I think as more of these details are emerge, including this story that I think has been wildly underreported in Australia, of police shooting at an asylum seeker who had actually tried to stop one of the shooters. There's stories like this that are coming out. It does seem like we need to ask some pretty important questions about the police response on the day.
Yeah, I viewed the longest video that exists of the attack, and I would not recommend that to anyone. I don't think anyone should seek that out, but there are some concerning things in that footage. This video has been written up a lot by the media. So Bondi Beach, so people know, is always patrolled by police on weekends because of the number of people there. And in addition, there are at least a couple of officers specifically tasked to the Hanukkah event there that appears to have been targeted. When the attackers opened fire, that means there were police already in the area. Despite that, throughout the shooting, this video, you can see a police car drive past where the attackers were firing from, and the attack continues for several minutes after that. The first people who engage with the shooters are bystanders. You know, there's a man across the street who very bravely starts yelling at them and trying to engage them in conversation and ask questions to distract and slow them down from firing. Several others try to intervene. Of course, most famously at this point, Ahmed, before the police appear and engage them. After the two gunmen are shot by police, one fatally, a good couple of minutes go by with no gunfire, but it's bystanders, not police, who eventually go up to the position where the gunmen are downed and gesture to police that it's safe to move in. One of those bystanders who went in was shot at, as you say, by police. Once police do close down on the downed gunman on this bridge, they sort of secure the scene for a very brief moment and then wander away from the entry and exit to the bridge, which just allows a mob to get up there. Fights break out. The suspects are kind of kicked in the head, just stuff that should not happen ever at a crime scene. And there are a lot of articles that go through this footage minute by minute. The best of these was done by the Fin Review, but very few of the others try and explain any of this or even try and estimate the police response time. And I understand not wanting to second guess people doing a very brave job. Like, this is not about individuals, but when you have over 100 shots fired at a scene where police already are, I think regardless of the bravery of some of the officers, it's fair for the media to ask questions about whether things could have been done differently and better.
Definitely. And New South Wales police were very, very defensive at all the press conferences, particularly on Sunday night. They were backed up by the New South Wales Premier and Anthony Albanese, which is not that surprising, particularly the night of. But we should be able to talk about what mistakes, if any, were made if we are actually serious about wanting to keep people safe. You know, and it doesn't make sense to just devote every media and political resource to stuff like the Siegel report when we could also be inquiring into things like policing strategy, response times, that kind of thing. I mean, everything you've kind of just talked through, I didn't know. You know, I think that's interesting, and it feels like it's very relevant here. In terms of another topic, Scott, that isn't getting enough attention, and in fact is being explicitly written about as something that is a distraction that the government shouldn't be focusing on, is gun control. Albanese and Minns were very quick to announce changes to this. On Sunday, Albanese convened National Cabinet on Monday, and they signed off on a raft of changes. But it's been astonishing to see political and media figures claim this is a distraction. It just feels like a full-on import of the US-style culture war on this. You know, when a mass shooting happens, the right say, this is not about guns, it's not about guns, leave our guns alone, this is about other stuff. One of the worst examples of this was the former Prime Minister John Howard, who was wheeled out to say he thought gun reform was a distraction from the government not being pro-Israel enough. So he was restating the Netanyahu criticism and saying that the government talking about gun reform is just them trying to distract from the fact that they should have been more supportive of Benjamin Netanyahu. Like, we are now seriously in this country arguing against gun reform because it shifts focus away from the attempts to make this all about Israel and Netanyahu. It's wild, and so much of the media, rather than actually supporting calls for gun reform, are actively resisting them by calling them a distraction. And just the very simple line on this, if you're confused as to why this should be an issue, or if you're talking to someone who's like, how is this about gun control? We had a mass shooting perpetrated by people who had a firearms license, and every weapon involved they legally owned. Like, obviously, this should be something we're talking about.
Yeah, I've been pretty shocked about the coverage of gun laws during this, even the stuff that has focused on it. Both Albanese and Minns, as we said, made this an early part of their response. And it's been reported, obviously, in the last few days that there are now 4 million guns in Australia, which is a lot more than when we first passed gun control. That has been aired. But to me, even these stories, Oz, have missed a far bigger issue that I wanted to talk about in this episode. And that is that, and I think very few people have realized this, even experts and political leaders, and that is that gun companies and gun design is getting around the intention of the laws that Australia passed after Port Arthur. And I think a lot of Australians, because those laws have been such a success, they've been talked about around the world, we've become complacent. People actually do not know about the subtleties in gun reform. So to remind people
about them. Yeah.
There we go. Let's learn something together. So after Port Arthur, which was a mass shooting where 35 people were killed, Australia passes our current gun laws. And most articles this week have made this all sound quite complicated, but really the laws are quite simple. The whole idea of them was to make it illegal to have guns that could fire quickly, so that one shooter could never kill so many people ever again. So that means that there's limits on the number of bullets Australian firearms can be loaded with, and crucially, rifles cannot be semi-automatic, which means the only legal guns are ones where there is a physical action between each shot to load a new bullet into the chamber. You can't keep just pulling the trigger. And all of this is about slowing down the rate of fire. But Oz, the alleged shooter on Sunday, was able to reload very fast, and that's because he used a rifle that is called a straight pull action, where a quick pullback on the bolt is enough and the gun does the rest. These were very rare in 1996 when our laws were first passed. In fact, they're pretty uncommon all over the world today. If you want to shoot, if you want to shoot quickly in America, you just buy a semi-auto. There's really not a big reason for straight pull rifles. But here in Australia, gun companies realise that straight pulls fit the Port Arthur laws, but are much faster than other actions. And straight pull rifles have become imported as especially good products in the Australian market by companies like Beretta, CZ, and one called Savage. I'll let them explain how this action works.
Impulse, the American-made straight-pull rifle, is instinctive and fast and encompasses breakthrough technology for repeat accuracy and enhanced safety. Impulse combines legendary Savage performance with the lightning-fast speed of a straight-pull action, delivering a rifle that will take down fast-moving targets or any big-game animal in your sights.
What I'm learning, Scott, and that I had no idea about, and I reckon probably a lot of people don't either, is essentially these modifications seem almost designed for the Australian market. Like, these gun companies have figured out there's a law here that doesn't make sense in America, doesn't make sense in other markets, but we figured out a way to help people fire more guns. We figured out a way to help people fire more bullets faster that gets us around Australian laws. That is incredible.
Yeah, and look, there's uses for these actions, but I think no doubt they've seen that there's a market demand for them in countries like Australia that have that limit on semi-autos. In fact, there's even more kind of designs that get around the intention of the Port Arthur laws, guns with button actions, where there's just a small button or a little lever next to the trigger, and that operates the whole action. You don't even have to take your finger really off the trigger, which allows multiple shots with a non-semi-auto rifle far quicker and easier than anyone would have imagined when we designed our post-Port Arthur laws. No one would have anticipated these kind of weapons. And to me, Oz, it's staggering this isn't a bigger story. Credit really only to Michael Batchelard at the Nine Papers at The Age, who I think is the only other journalist I've seen pick up on this as a story since Sunday. And just finally, Oz, we did touch on the intelligence and just finally, Oz, at the beginning of the episode, we did touch briefly on the intelligence failures, but I think those are becoming such a significant part of the story. It's worth just elaborating on the kind of questions that could be getting more coverage. I mean, one thing is that, you know, when we talk about the flags that could have been raised, whether there was anything in these gunmen researching the event, in researching the explosive devices they made, in making contact with anyone associated with the Islamic State. You know, we mention those as flags because ASIO has the powers to be collecting that information. We signed over huge powers over our electronic communication and those kind of things after 9/11, during the War on Terror. ASIO has the powers to look at a lot of that. And the idea, like, if you're critical of those laws, the least that signing over all of those powers was supposed to do is keep us safe.
Totally.
You know, I think the question is, you know, are they being used smartly, accurately at the people who are the biggest danger? And then, you know, who is being investigated? You know, we had last year a case where the federal police posed as Islamic radical terrorists and were involved in the radicalization of a minor who had intellectual difficulties. The judge in that case was absolutely damning about how AFP officers went about that investigation. And you wonder, how is it that multiple officers, months and months of work, you know, at one point I believe they bought this young man a birthday cake. How is that level of resource going into an investigation like that when you have people flying to the Philippines to go
on watch lists,
who have histories, going to the Philippines to have military style training? Where is the investigative resource being allocated by these very well funded institutions? And then radicalization. You know, you look at the kind of people historically who have been radicalized, what we know about these two alleged gunmen. They are often really isolated individuals. We have thought, perhaps wrongly, I think there's been a complacency about organizations like the Islamic State being able to reach these people. Have we, as a sort of society, taken our eye off the ball of social isolation, of radical ideas spreading in the sort of rabbit holes of the internet in certain communities, and what can be done to, you know, let the light into those areas, to give people other paths, to de-radicalize people who are maybe on this trajectory? All of those things together as a basket seem like far bigger elements of this story than what some of the political press seem obsessed by.
Yeah, absolutely. After the break, Scott, we're going to take a look at the conspiracy theories that are doing the rounds and why that now seems an inevitable part of what happens following these kinds of events.
Another element of this story, as well as the media's obsessions, things that aren't being aired enough, is disinformation. And we did talk about that on Monday. We talked about disinformation that was being spread during the shooting, right-wing accounts laundering this story through a framing of white supremacy. And that has continued at a really fast pace, and I would say gotten even worse and more sophisticated. But rather than go over every single example, because I think in a way we've said what needs to be said about the urgency of countering that and given people warnings, since then there's another part of this that has really disturbed me this week, and that's this kind of false flag, the shooting is not real or was perpetrated by someone else type of stuff that's begun circling. I know I've seen it come up and even get liked and shared by people I sort of thought wouldn't get down this kind of hole. I mean, yeah, have you seen this pop up?
I've seen this pop up, and I had the same initial reaction, which is like, whoa, we're doing this? But then I thought, like, okay, part of why I think it's so shocking for us is we just don't have that many events like this in Australia. But in countries where they do, like the US, this is what always happens. And it doesn't matter how straightforward, a particular shooting is, and, even if it seems really obvious what motivated someone and why they did it. We live in a world, in an information ecosystem, in a divided time and place where it doesn't matter how obvious and factual and clearly laid out an incident is, there are going to be conspiracy theories around it. That is distressing. Like, that's not me saying like we have to just live with it. Like, we desperately need to find ways to combat it and to figure out how to deal with it, but that is just where we are at. And we're not that used to it in Australia, but this has confirmed that, yeah, we're not somehow magically immune from the same forces that spread, fake information as the rest of the world. And the problem is, and it goes back to your point in a way about, the isolation that can drive people to radicalization. I'm not saying that people who consume conspiracy theories are going to become violent terrorists or shooters, but these are the same kind of processes applying, right? People feeling confused, scared, anxious about the world. They think it doesn't make sense. Some of what they see that seems shocking is actually real. They enter information bubbles. They go down a path of being exposed to more and more information, and generally over time, less and less of that is actually true. Faith in the mainstream media and mainstream politics is at an all-time low. That's how we get to this point. There is no magic fix for it. You said something at the start of this episode that I think is really important. The way the media has approached not just the last few days, but the last couple of years in particular, which has diminished mainstream trust in them, makes this stuff worse because it pushes people away. And, some of those people come to us and we try to do our best to be rigorous and to fact check. But Scott, there are like accounts in Australia 10 to 100 times bigger than us who just promote fake news and false information and conspiracy theories. And that is a challenge. So there's a responsibility I think a lot of people with power have that I don't think they are taking very seriously right now. Yeah,
totally. Yes, absolutely. The most outrageous example of this kind of stuff we're talking about, I would say, Oz, which has been reported on quite a bit, is this AI image of a lobbyist who was shot at Bondi, of him having makeup and fake blood applied to him by a makeup artist. I mean, anyone who has liked or shared that image, I don't know what to say. This was spread by an account with over 400,000 followers. The account has an AI-generated face as a profile picture, which is maybe a sign to look for. And it just seems this account to engagement farm off any pro-Palestine keyword and then just create content and stuff off of that. This is the thing. I really don't know with this stuff that is being shared, whether it's by bots or scams or like planted agent provocateurs or just people who have gone down that rabbit hole and become deeply broken by the state of the world and are slightly lost. I have no idea what to do with those kind of things, just AI generated slop. The thing to me that has upset me most is actually the more insidious stuff I wanted to briefly mention, and it's really distressed me, and that's people who keep posting about the political activity as some of the people who were shot, that they had promoted the Israeli government, that they'd supported the assault on Gaza. I mean, first and foremost, like ethically, what's the idea here? That they deserved to be gunned down at the beach? Really? Like, because of their views? Is that where we're at? And second, these gunmen shot indiscriminately into a crowd of Jews celebrating Hanukkah. There were children getting face paint done, food stalls selling like traditional Jewish food, and they shot over 100 shots into that crowd. If anyone thinks it's relevant in any way that they can find 2 or 3 victims with political views they think are reprehensible. I just, like, God knows what to do with that. And then, like, politically, I don't understand what purpose this serves either. Like, does anyone think it's helping to spread that right now in this environment? Like, who is that convincing of anything? How is that helping the situation? And, like, I'm sort of sorry I'm getting a bit worked up about it. I really don't think it's a significant number of people doing this Oz, but the few I have seen, it's just upset me. And I do think it has to kind of be called out. And I think in progressive circles, even though this is not very widespread, I really do think it is a minority. I think there's such a cynicism about mainstream discourse that people are very defensive and haven't really been as active in rejecting it as probably they should have been.
Yeah, I think people are confused and disoriented. I think a lot of the confusion and disorientation that exists is from people who I think are a bit overwhelmed and confused and distressed by, you know, the fact that, like, the response from the world to what they've seen over the last 2 years is obviously quite different to the response that they've seen in Australia over the last couple of days. And I personally don't think that's necessarily helpful. Like, I think there are really valid points to make about why the West didn't do more to stop the genocide in Gaza. I don't necessarily think that needs to be pitted against how the media has covered and the level of attention the Bondi attack has gotten. But I just think that is a factor for a lot of people.
Yeah, and I honestly wanted to talk about it in a way because I think what we're doing, what your drop sites and ets and whoever and deep cuts or whatever are doing is that cynicism with the mainstream discourse, with the West, with the mainstream media, has to be channeled into something that has a humanity and a tether to evidence and fact and whatever. And it is like a legitimate cynicism and anger, but it has to be directed towards a content that comes with some shared humanity and some grounding in evidence. And the risk, if independent media that was conscientious hadn't started up, is that there would be, I think, far more of this because it would be the only alternative.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of the stuff you're talking about is, and it's not, I'm not saying this out of a sense of like jealousy and wanting numbers for the sake of it, but like it is concerning when independent accounts that are publishing total misinformation and unhelpful conspiracies are getting hundreds of thousands and millions of views. Like, that's not good. There are independent outlets that are not doing what the mainstream media is doing, that are fact checking and doing good reporting that people should be engaging with and sharing. That exists, you know? Yeah.
Yeah.
Scott, as we said at the start of the episode, this is our final regular news episode for the year. It is a pretty heavy and intense episode to go out with, but I wanted to take a minute just to reflect on the year and kind of what we've built here at Lamestream. It feels incredibly weird to me that it's only been like 7.5 months. Feels like we've been doing this forever in the best possible way. In other ways, you know, it feels like it's gone super, super, super fast. Just thinking about making more than 50 episodes, all the different things we've talked about, all the different stories we've covered. I mean, how are you feeling about where Lamestream is at as we wrap up?
Yeah, it's probably only going to hit me in a couple of weeks, but it has been incredible. I mean, the biggest surprise, obviously, is you never know who's going to listen. You know, we set this up believing we'd find an audience and believing we could do something that people would be interested in, but you never know who that is exactly. And it's been amazing to get to know people who listen to the show, whether it's at the live events, getting to meet people in person and have a chat, or just seeing the comments on Instagram, reading emails. It's like pretty humbling, Oz, to have all kinds of different people, different types of people from different parts of the country, like who have found this project of ours useful or meaningful to them in some way. I don't know, what surprised you about doing this as we get to the end of the year?
Yeah, I think like you, the community that has built up so quickly has been really, really moving. You know, we've got tens of thousands of listeners the feedback we get, the really like smart and interested and lovely and thoughtful feedback. And, you know, sometimes it's people saying, I don't know about that. I work in this space and I think you should have touched on this thing. That's awesome. Like the fact that we've got such a wide range of listeners who are happy to encourage us to look into things, to give us tips and to point out when they think we might have missed something that they know about. It's kind of the best kind of relationship you can have with an audience. And ending the year with those events and getting to meet a couple of hundred Lamestream listeners live was pretty special. Getting stopped on the street every now and then by someone who's like, "Oh, are you that guy from Lamestream?" That's really, really nice and feels great. And I'm really excited, Scott, about where we are going next and what we've got in store for next year.
I think the other thing I thought I'd mention that I have been really surprised by is the number of stories we've broken, honestly. I was like, I am so proud when I think about the fact that while doing all of this, setting up a business, starting a podcast, recording all of this, in between, we've managed to break stories on whether it's the campaign against Khalid Sabsabi, job cuts at the ABC, that SMH front page claiming Hamas endorsed Albanese, basically, the National Press Club cancelling a journo for being too pro-Palestine, let alone the whole Mahmoud Fazal Sydney Morning Herald messages fiasco. Like, I look back on doing so much of that with you, and I know we both want to break more stories next year and do more of that, but I'm so proud we've been able to do journalism on really big, important stories in this country while doing all of this, and that the subscribers who sign up for the newsletter have trusted us enough to pay for that and have enabled us and backed us to do that kind of journalism is really humbling.
Yeah, it's amazing. We say it all the time, but it is literally true. Like, subscribers give us the resources we need to make this show and to report the stories that we report. And hopefully we get even more next year and we can do even more stuff. And Scott, just before we go out, I think, you know, big thank you to everyone who has been involved in helping us make Lamestream behind the scenes. In particular, our producer Bez, our video producer Schwen, and Izzy, who was our fantastic researcher for much of the year. That is it from us. If you enjoyed this episode of the show, we'd love it if you left us a review or shared it with a friend. If you've got any questions for us generally, or you want to ask us a question for our mailbag episode, you can hit us up at contact@lamestream.com.au. We'll be back next week with our first special summer episode. But otherwise, Scott, see you in the new year.
I can't wait to talk about some more fun topics over summer with you, and then see everyone back in the new year for more Lamestream.